Welcome back to Combat Mission Red Thunder, where we're going to take a look at German Volkssturm companies, where they came from, what they're armed with, how they're organised, and a necessarily pretty short section on how to get the most out of them on the battlefield in combat mission. So the Volkssturm was essentially a national German militia set up on the 25th of September 1944, firmly under the control of the Nazi Party rather than the Wehrmacht. With pretty much every single able-bodied man and various categories of less able-bodied men already pressed into military service, the Volkssturm was forced to conscript the leftovers, ending up with a mix of Hitler Youth teens, elderly World War I veterans, and invalids passed over by previous conscription waves. Training, armament, equipment, and even uniforms ranged from barely adequate to non-existent as the Volkssturm competed with the Wehrmacht for resources. Motivation and tactical skill could vary significantly and did not always go hand in hand. A unit of indoctrinated fanatics might fight to the last man without having the slightest idea what they were doing. A unit of press-ganged First World War veterans might be able to put up a reasonable defence if they didn't think that surrendering at the first opportunity was the most sensible thing to do. In theory, units were raised to defend their local areas and commanded by local party officials. In practice, they could be sent pretty much anywhere and end up under the relatively tight control of regular Wehrmacht units scrabbling to scrape some kind of defence together. As you might expect from this, historically speaking, Volkssturm units were not tremendously effective, even as minor speed bumps. There is a reason why the regular German forces had not tapped into certain manpower, weapon and equipment pools, and there is a reason why the Volkssturm was wrapped up in apocalyptic Nazi propaganda in which sheer indomitable willpower would somehow inexplicably triumph over Allied and Soviet superiority. All this makes the Volkssturm an interesting force from a historical perspective. From a combat mission tactical perspective, I think it's best not to be under any illusions about what they might achieve. That's a little on the story behind the Volkssturm. In Combat Mission Red Thunder, they are present from February 1945 onwards, and the only available formation is the Volkssturm Battalion, which has three of the companies we're going to be looking at. It's worth noting here that in this video we're going to be looking at the complete Volkssturm Company as modelled in combat mission, and that given the nature of the final stages of World War II, realistic scenarios are unlikely to feature completely intact units like this. You're much more likely to be looking at fragmentary, seriously under-strength Volkssturm units. The basic fighting unit of the company is the Volkssturm Squad. This consists of 9 men with a variety of whatever small arms Germany could scrape together in 1945. The combatants are most likely to be armed with a bolt-action rifle of some description, either a Kar-98K, a G209I, a G256R, or a G281E. The designations for the G rifles might sound new and exciting. Trust me, they're not. The Kar-98K is, of course, the standard German bolt-action rifle of World War II, firing 7.92 by 57mm Mauser from a 5-round internal magazine. The G209I is the Italian M1891 rifle, otherwise known as the Carcano. In 1943, when the Italians signed an armistice with the Allies and the Germans occupied Italy, they basically disarmed the Italian military and ended up with huge stockpiles of Carcanos. Originally, the rifle fired a 6.5 by 52mm round. According to the manual, they were rebored to take the standard 7.92mm Mauser cartridge, but in-game troops armed with the G209I still appear to carry and fire 6.5mm. That doesn't make a massive amount of difference. More important is the fact that whatever the ammunition being used, it's fed from a 6-round integral magazine. The G256R is simply a Russian Mosin Nagant. Unsurprisingly, given the early stages of the war in the east, the Germans had plenty of Mosins in their inventory, along with large quantities of captured 7.62 by 53R ammunition for them. This is the same standard rifle as used by Soviet infantry in World War II, with the fairly common 5-round integral magazine. Finally, the G28-1E is the British Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III Star rifle, captured in large numbers at Dunkirk and in North Africa. This stands out from the crowd by having a 10-round magazine, but it's still firing British 303 Mark 7 ammunition. If you're like me, and you're never ever going to remember the G triple-digit designation for each of these, the easy way to work out what rifle you're looking at is to focus on the last letter. I for Italian, R for Russian, and E for English. Although bolt actions are going to make up the majority of weapons in Volkssturm squads, they are often supplemented by a random mix of automatic weapons. The most familiar of these are the MP40 submachine gun and the MP44 Sturmgewehr or assault rifle. The MP40 fires 9x9mm parabellum from a 32-round stick magazine at about 500 rounds a minute, which is relatively standard for World War II submachine guns. The MP44, on the other hand, fires the intermediate 7.92x33 Kurz cartridge from a 30-round magazine and can be fired on single shot or fully automatic. The MP4 was a revolutionary weapon, combining the long-range capability of a rifle with the short-range firepower of the submachine gun, and set the direction that standard issue infantry small arms were going to go in up until the present day. That's great, obviously, but it doesn't mean that it's going to magically help a 60-year-old man fend off swarms of Soviet SMG infantry. In addition to these two weapons, Volkssturm troops can be equipped with one of two last-ditch emergency weapons, the MP3008 and the MP507. To cut a long story short, these are both simple designs intended to be produced in a Germany whose industrial capacity has been gutted by Allied bombing or even overrun by Allied or Soviet ground forces. The MP3008 might look familiar to anyone who has seen the Sten gun on which it's based, though this might say more about the Sten gun than it says about the MP3008. The main difference is that the magazine now feeds in from the bottom rather than the side, but otherwise the weapon fires 9mm parabellum ammunition from standard 32-round MP40 magazines. The MP507, otherwise known as the Volkssturmgewehr, or People's Assault Rifle, is a similar, massively simplified build-it-in-your-basement kind of weapon, though this time chambered for 9.92mm Kurz and using standard 30-round MP44 box magazines. In theory, this is a semi-automatic weapon. In-game in Fire and Rubble, it appears to function as a fully automatic one. Both of these are somewhat interesting in their own right. I'll leave a couple of forgotten weapons links down in the description if you want to know more, but realistically speaking, the minor details of small arms don't really matter that much at the pointy end in combat mission. Individual Volkssturm squads can vary in quality, and this affects what kinds of weapons they're armed with. Lower quality squads will have more bolt-action rifles and fewer automatic weapons. Higher quality squads will have more automatic weapons and fewer bolt actions. There are a few significant problems with having this much weapon variety across a squad, most importantly in terms of ammunition compatibility. Between the 8 potential weapons, there are 5 different types of ammunition, potentially making for small restricted pools of each ammunition type, instead of one large pool that everyone can share. This is compounded by the apparent lack of any webbing or load-carrying equipment. Volkssturm troops in combat mission can come in one of 3 uniforms: standard, meaning civilian clothes, greatcoat, which is the same but with a greatcoat on top, and military, which is a mix of civilian and military clothing. None of these variants have anywhere for Pixeltreppen to stash their ammunition except for their pocket, so they tend to carry a limited amount of reloads. Usually 2 or 3 magazines, or 6 to 8 5-round stripper clips for the rifles, plus a hand grenade each. Somewhat surprisingly, given the concerning state of the Volkssturm's infantry individual weapons, squads are actually very generously equipped with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The Panzerfaust was another revolutionary one, a one-shot disposable rocket with a significant shaped charge warhead on the end. They were cheap to manufacture, relatively easy to use, and could reliably punch holes in most Allied and Soviet tanks. The main drawback is that they were very short-range weapons. The variant most commonly found in Volkssturm squads in-game is the Panzerfaust 60 with a range of 60 meters, though some of the more recent Panzerfaust 100s with a 100-meter range do crop up. Letting enemy armour get that close, and if the enemy is not a potato, the infantry supporting said armour, is risky, though I suppose the one-shot nature of the Panzerfaust becomes a little irrelevant because you're unlikely to get more than one shot off in those circumstances anyway. Volkssturm squads do carry a lot of these, usually between 6 and 8, and while the Panzerfaust isn't exactly suited to prolonged engagements and is not tremendously accurate, any Allied or Soviet tank that strays too close to concealed or unsuppressed Volkssturm is taking a serious risk. Finally, the squad is commanded by a squad leader or Gruppenführer, who can be identified by a single pip on his collar tab if he's wearing the military uniform. The Gruppenführer is usually armed with one of the automatic weapons, but can sometimes be found carrying a rifle, and if he's wearing civilian clothing then he's basically indistinguishable from the rank and file. 3 of these squads make up a platoon, which is led by a platoon HQ team. This consists of 2 soldiers, the first of whom is the platoon leader or Zugführer. He may have 2 pips on his collar, but is otherwise easily identifiable by being armed with a pistol. Like the other Volkssturm weapons, there are several types of pistol he could be armed with. The standard German Walther P38, the 640B, which is the Browning High Power from Belgium, the G671I, which is the captured Beretta M1934, and 2 types of captured Russian pistol, the G612R, actually the Nagant revolver, and the G615R, which is the TT33 or Tokarev. Honestly, while there are some minor differences between these weapons, their practical impact is borderline negligible, and their most significant effect is to make the platoon leader stand out. The second man in the platoon HQ is simply a soldier equipped with a bolt-action rifle. The platoon HQ has no additional equipment at all, so no binoculars, and more importantly, no radio, so they're going to need to stay within shouting or hand signal distance of their troops to keep those C2 links up. Together, 3 of these platoons make up a Volkssturm Company, which is commanded by Company HQ and has a series of weapons teams attached. The Company HQ is almost identical to the Platoon HQ, being a 2-man team. The company commander, in this case a Company Führer, has 3 pips on his collar if he's wearing the military uniform. They still don't have a radio or binoculars, severely limiting their usefulness, but the second man in the team might be armed with an automatic weapon or a Panzerfaust, which I guess is slightly better. The attached weapons teams are similarly underwhelming, 3 light machine gun teams and a pair of anti-tank teams. The LMG teams consist of 2 men, an ammo bearer usually equipped with a rifle, and the machine gunner himself, who is usually equipped with an MG15, but if he's lucky he might be armed with an MG34 or an MG42. These are all related weapons. The earliest, the MG15, is actually a version of the MG13 for aircraft use, which in earlier stages of the war could be found, for example, as the nose gunner's weapon of HE-111 bombers. By the end of the war, with machine gun production lagging far behind Germany's needs, MG15s were being removed from aircraft and issued out to infantry units with 75-round double drum magazines in lieu of the MG34 and 42. These last 2 weapons are the standard ones for the regular army, and here they're being used in the light role on a bipod. The quick guide is that the MG34 came first, with the MG42 being a development that was easier to manufacture and maintain. In-game, both are fed from 50-round drums. All 3 of these weapons are chambered in 7.92mm Mauser, and they all share a high rate of fire. Part of the theory behind this is that targets on the modern battlefield will be fleeting targets. The enemy will try to minimize the amount of time he is exposed, and a high rate of fire will enable the gunner to fill that short exposure time with a lot of bullets instead of just 1 or 2, increasing the chances of scoring a hit. The downside to this high rate of fire is obviously a high rate of ammunition consumption, a problem which is exacerbated by the Volkssturm's lack of load-bearing equipment. Between the gunner and the ammo bearer, the MG15 teams carry 475 rounds of ammunition, and the MG34 or MG42 teams carry 450 rounds. This is not a lot. By comparison, the same kind of 2-man LMG team in the regular German army is carrying about 1,000 rounds. The 2 anti-tank teams are made up of 2 men armed with 2 Panzerfausts in either the 60 or 100 variants. And that's it. They don't have any other weapons, not even any hand grenades or anything like that. On the plus side, a 2-man team is fairly easy to conceal. The numerous downsides should be pretty obvious. That's the bulk of the Volkssturm Company. The formation also includes a 4th or weapons platoon. This consists of a 1-man platoon HQ, another Zugführer armed with a pistol and 2 pips if he's wearing the military uniform, and 4 weapons teams, 2 heavy machine gun teams and 2 medium mortar teams. The HMG teams are armed with tripod-mounted MG34s or 42s. The only differences between these weapons and their light rail counterparts described above is that they use belts instead of magazines, and obviously the tripods offer a much more stable firing platform. They can be fired without the tripod, which takes a few seconds to set up or tear down, though it's important to note that if deploying in buildings, setting the weapon up will take much longer than deploying out in the open due to the need to rearrange the furniture and make a reasonable kind of fighting position. Aside from the gunner himself, the teams consist of a Gruppenführer and 3 more soldiers, one of whom feeds the gun and is entirely unarmed, the others being armed with the usual random assortment of Volkssturm weapons. The MG itself has a reasonable amount of ammunition, 1,750 rounds of 8mm Mauser, which makes it considerably more useful in extended firefights than the LMG teams attached to the company HQ. The medium mortars are 81mm Granatwerfer 34s, which, like the HMGs, are regular weapons used by the Wehrmacht. These have a range of between 54 and 2,400 meters, though obviously the accuracy drops off significantly at longer ranges. Each team consists of 4 men, a Gruppenführer and 3 soldiers. One of these is unarmed and carries the mortar, another is armed only with a pistol and, similar to the Gruppenführer, the 4th carries a random bolt-action rifle or automatic. The team carries a total of 18 81mm bombs, 16 high explosive and 2 smoke. In common with the rest of the Volkssturm battalion, no one in the weapons platoon is equipped with either binoculars or a radio, so trying to use these mortars for indirect fire requires the observer to be within shouting distance of the mortars themselves or the weapons platoon HQ, providing the weapons platoon HQ is within shouting distance of the mortars. This obviously restricts their utility somewhat. Direct fire is of course still possible and likely to be considerably more effective, plus a better use of the very limited ammunition supply. It does, however, obviously run the risk of the enemy shooting back. That then is the Volkssturm Company in Combat Mission Red Thunder. How do you get the most out of it on the battlefield? The important caveat here is that it is early days for the Fire and Rubble module, and I haven't played a lot with Volkssturm, so your mileage and experience may vary a little here. Even just on paper though, a Volkssturm Company is a light infantry force which lacks the ammunition to sustain a firefight. A squad engaging an area target inside 100 meters will completely run out of ammunition in about 4 minutes, meaning that if you're trying to do forward movement with Volkssturm platoons, you've got 4 minutes worth of suppression and therefore 4 minutes to get your maneuver element to where it needs to be, which is somewhat optimistic. This, of course, assumes that the firepower your Volkssturm are generating is enough to win fire superiority in the first place, which also seems unlikely when compared to the amount of firepower that even individual Soviet or Allied squads can put out. The Volkssturm are really missing a light machine gun here, but there just aren't enough to go around. I'm not going to say that they won't work, but I would say that it's not going to work very well. Potentially you can use the weapons platoon as a base of fire, but of course if you increase the scale of the fight, then the enemy is likely to respond in kind, and chances are he's always going to be able to outcompete you with firepower. In other words, the Volkssturm are probably at their best in short, sharp, close-range engagements where you just might be able to inflict some damage, maybe get a minute or 2 of local superiority, and then either die where you stand or attempt to fall back as required. Trying to set up effectively and take advantage of the terrain to force these kinds of engagements, exploiting dense terrain like urban areas and forests as well as close reverse slopes, is key, as is having covered routes to escape or relocate through if that's what you want to do. The only real ray of sunshine for the Volkssturm, and the only real way they stand out from the crowd apart from their stampy uniforms and inability to actually achieve anything, is that they have all those Panzerfausts, and they really do give them a lot of close-in anti-tank capability. The tricky part is actually using that capability, but if you can separate enemy armour from its supporting infantry and successfully exploit the terrain to ambush enemy tanks, then you should have a decent chance of taking them out. That said, it's worth remembering that firing something like a Panzerfaust inside an enclosed space is not a pleasant experience due to the backblast, and your teams are probably going to end up suppressed if they start engaging from buildings. Overall though, The Volkssturm are a last-ditch, bottom-of-the-barrel force, and they perform like one. If you're commanding them, the less you expect, the less disappointed you're going to be. In scenarios, with any luck you'll have some regular troops as well, and it might be best to use the Volkssturm to screen them, providing both early warning of the enemy main effort and soaking up his attention and firepower before he reaches forces that are actually going to be useful. Personally, I think the Volkssturm are more interesting because of their historical context and their huge variety in weapons and uniforms than they are fun to play with. They really show how much Germany is clutching at straws by the end of the war. Of course, your mileage may vary in that respect. Regardless, hope you all found this useful, and I'll catch you in the next video.